we're just getting ready to begin our webinar, The Ministry of Managing Money, Congregational Finances and the Stewardship Webinar Series. In case you think, make sure you're in the right place, this is part 1, and we're going to be talking about where do I begin? Financial roles, vocabulary, and budgets. This is the first of a series of 4 webinars that we have designed for treasurers. If any of you have ever attended a treasurer's workshop before, you may recognize some of the material. We've updated it, but usually this would be a workshop that would be done at a half day in a congregation or in a presbytery, and there'd be a chance to answer questions and that. But we thought with Zoom, it's harder to participate for a long time online. So we divided it into 4 issues and 4 topics. So somebody just asked if we're going to cover software, and we are covering that today, but it's at the very end. So hang in, we will get there. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Just a little bit of protocol for today's meeting. You're going to stay muted, and our host has already muted you all. So if you have any comments you need to make, use the chat. And hopefully you can find the chat setting on your mobile or on your computer. The chat will be monitored, and questions will either be asked as we go along or at the end. At the end, there may be an opportunity to unmute. We're going to see how it's going, and we're just doing an experiment with this. We had over 150 people registered, so we just have to see how we can juggle. But if we get a chance to unmute you to ask questions, otherwise ask them in chat and we'll try to answer them. This is also good to know that this is sort of our first one. Where do we begin? Financial roles, budgets, and software, and vocabulary. We're going to talk fairly high level. The subsequent webinars that we're getting into, the ones that looking at gifting and receipting, they're really going to dig deep and give you lots of examples. And when we look at expenditures, it's going to really show, you know, how do you do an authorization? How do you do expenditures? And then how do you generate reports, and what type of reports will be in the 4th one in doing reporting. But we're going to cover it all today and give you a very much an overview. And then if you've got more questions, we'll try to answer them at the end or in the subsequent webinar. Go to the next one. Oh, so the cool thing about doing a webinar like this is that we can have lots of people presenting. If we were just meeting in a church building, probably there would just be one of us present. But so I'm going to talk and introduce and host you and talk a little bit about stewardship. But I've got Don Muir from the General Assembly office here, who is going to talk about the financial roles and how they all connect together in the congregation. Maurice Mawhinney, who has been a treasurer of the Presbytery of West Toronto, is on the PCC Finance Committee, and one of the authors of the Treasurer's Handbook is going to present most of the information on treasurers, about what you need to know to be a treasurer. So he's got a wealth of experience. So I'm so excited that he's presenting for us. Oliver Ding, the Chief Financial Officer for the PCC, is on the call as well and will be available to answer questions at the end. Nicole Jeffrey from the Pensions and Benefits Office has joined us as well. And she'll join particularly with some of her other staff in the 3rd session when we look at expenditures to really talk about pensions and benefits and how that works, but she'll introduce it briefly here. And then Jim MacDonald, the development manager, is here with stewardship and plan giving as well. He's the one monitoring the chat and the one who helped pull together all of the slides that you're looking at. So I'm really glad to be working with this team today. There's also some resources that provide additional information for this webinar. So most of the information that we cover, you can find in the Treasurer's Handbook, which is online at presbyterian.c/resources and finance. We're particularly looking at section 1 and section 2 today, the role of the treasurer and preparing budgets. But we actually have thrown in a bunch more information as well. Some of the other information for today came from the next slide. Church Finances for Missional Leaders. And this is a really excellent book written by Bonnie Ives Marden, and it comes out of the States. She's an American, but she sat with me on a number of committees for the Ecumenical Stewardship Center, and she really has a depth of knowledge and great ideas for best practices for doing church finances for missional leaders, and she helps put it in a context of mission. So a number of the ideas and concepts that we got came from this book. Very easy to read if you want to sort of dig in even deeper. So before we begin, we want to do everything in the context of a biblical call to stewardship. And just wanted to remind you that everything we have from the very beginning and throughout the Bible, God has created everything and owns everything and has asked us to take care of it. So that's what we're doing. All the work we do as treasurers and in mission and ministry, it is mission and it is ministry and part of stewardship, because we're helping to manage the resources God has given. So as stewards of God, we try to use all the opportunities and resources to show love for God and our neighbor with all we have and all that we are. And treasurers are some of my favorite people, because I think that you really help us to do that. And I see this exactly as ministry. So when we're doing it, we have to keep in mind a few principles about the way we do it. Next. Remember that a steward is a manager. So as managers, we want to be sure that we're managing the resources as God would. I think it's a great quote from C.S. Lewis that every faculty we have, your power of thinking or of moving your limbs from moment to moment, is given to you by God. If we devoted every moment of our whole life exclusively to God's service, we could not give God anything that was not, in a sense, his own already. As stewards and as treasurers, we remember that this work, we're called to be both generous and joyful. I love the quote from 2 Corinthians 9:7 that God loves a cheerful giver. So we should be working with some of the happiest people in the world because they're giving to the church. It's also important to remember that though it's difficult to ask people to be generous if the church leaders are not generous. So when we look at things about budgets and how we're spending money, how are we doing this in ways that are both joyful and generous? How does our budget generous to the community, to the world, and to our country? How do we express our generosity through what we've given and through how we're spending the gifts that have been given? This work is also very humbling work, and we should do it with great humility because we are serving not on our own, but with and through God. And so we remember that it is Christ we are serving and Christ who is serving through us. It's nothing that we do just on our own. And finally, the work we do as treasurers and looking at books is accountable. So when we talk about these different concepts and the different processes that have been established, there's theological, moral, ethical, and legal accountability that have been built into it. So it's both to God, to the people who generously give, accountability to the denomination, and to the government, the authority God has placed over us and who allows us to provide tax receipts that people can use to reduce their taxes. So this is just some of the work that we do as treasurers, and I'm really glad that you've joined us, and I look forward to getting to know you more. And right now, though, I'm going to turn it over to Dawn to talk about financial roles in a congregation.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is Don Muir, and I serve as a deputy clerk in the General Assembly office. Part of how I spend each day is providing advice on matters of church polity to anyone who asks, and sometimes even to people who don't ask. My part in this webinar is to present an overview of the role of the treasurer and how it relates to the work of other individuals and groups within a typical Presbyterian congregation, so that together the treasurer and others help achieve the financial goals of the congregation. And we can change to the next slide, thank you. This slide illustrates the treasurer's connections with some of these other individuals and groups in a typical church, and how we'll be talking about, as I move through slide by slide, we'll be talking about how their work interacts. You'll see that the treasurer has more contact with some of these people than others, and the degree of contact may vary from congregation to congregation, depending on how it's set up and who's doing what jobs and so on. So the next slide. When a person becomes a member of a congregation, they commit to participating in the life of the church in the service of Jesus Christ. There's a section of the Book of Forms that says that it's the duty of members to respect and encourage the minister, to cooperate with the session, nurture a caring spirit, maintain a lively interest in the concerns of the whole church, to contribute heartily or generously to Christian ministry, and to manifest a Christian spirit in all relationships. These lofty goals might be lived out in a variety of ways, according to your time and your interests and strengths and so on. For example, you might participate in some of the programs of the church, or you might join a committee that is of interest to you. You might participate in the calling of a minister. You might be asked to vote on decisions that are placed before the congregation at congregational meetings, including the annual general meeting of the congregation. At a typical annual general meeting, you'll be asked to review reports from the previous year, adopt a plan for the congregation for the coming year, and that will include a budget that will provide the funding to enable those plans to take place. You'll support the congregation's ministry plans with your own time and talent and treasure. You might be involved in writing or voting on investment policies or endowment policies or spending policies. At one point in the meeting, you'll be asked to vote on who will audit the books, the financial records of the church. And from time to time, as members of the congregation, you'll be asked to vote on the election of elders. One of the most important decisions we make is we choose people that will help to provide leadership and pastoral care and oversight alongside the minister of any congregation. The elders and the minister, of course, form the session. Speaking of session, the session is the governing body of a congregation. All other boards and committees and groups and organizations of the congregation are subject to the care and the general oversight of the session. The session is deeply involved in two areas of the financial life of the congregation. Those two areas are encouraging stewardship in general and also encouraging support for Presbyterian sharing. And I'll just elaborate on those 2 points a little bit. The session is responsible for all aspects of the stewardship and mission of the congregation. Stewardship, of course, is not just about money. It also refers to time and energy, to skills and knowledge, ability and experience that people can commit to this to support God's mission as it's lived out in a congregation. But it is about finances too. So one of the jobs of the session is to keep a Christian understanding of stewardship before the congregation. One of the specific aspects of the stewardship and mission of a congregation is also the session's responsibility, and that is to encourage congregational support for Presbyterian sharing. Presbyterian sharing is the national budget of our denomination, and so it helps to finance so many of our ministries nationally and internationally. Some sessions may choose to fulfill these financial responsibilities within the congregation by appointing a committee of the session, a stewardship committee, or it may go by some other name, but a committee that is designed to encourage stewardship and support for Presbyterian sharing. That committee hopefully is going to include people who are creative, enthusiastic, intentional about stewardship education, and are very good at inspiring others and leading others to be excited about this aspect of Christian ministry. There are resources available through Stewardship and Plan Giving to support the work of such a committee if your session forms one. Session and board are expected to work very closely together. They work closely together to ensure that all the aspects of the financial affairs of a congregation are managed well, are managed in keeping with the ministry plans of the local congregation, and also they're managed to comply with the directives of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, usually directives that come to us through the General Assembly. Board of Managers are elected by the congregation each year, usually at the congregation's annual meeting. 1/3 of the board members retire and their replacements are elected. Normally, a congregation will look for people who exhibit skills for maintaining church buildings and managing financial records of the congregation, because those are the two of the most important functions of this group. At the time of the election, the congregation may also appoint
Did we just lose Dawn?
Sorry, no, I think that you just muted.
No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I don't know what happened, but okay, thank you.
We lost you at Board of Managers. You were just starting.
Oh, just at the beginning of that? Okay, let me back up a little bit then. So I said Board of Managers are elected by the congregation, and each year, usually at the annual meeting of the congregation, 1/3 of the board retires and their replacements are elected. Normally, a congregation, when they're electing people to serve on the board, search for people who exhibit skills in maintaining church buildings and managing finances, because those are two of the main functions of the board. At the time of the election, the congregation might appoint the convener and the secretary and the treasurer from among the board members. If that's not done, then the board appoints these positions themselves at their first meeting following their election. It's the job of the convener to ensure the board meetings are well organized and managed. The secretary is to keep accurate records of board decisions. And then there's the treasurer. The treasurer will have a very close working relationship with the board. In that role, the treasurer, I think I maybe switch to the next slide, Jim. Yeah, the treasurer will be expected to receive and deposit revenues, ensure that the stipends are paid for the ministers, ensure bills are paid, regular bills, subject to the direction of the board, keep accounts of the congregation along with all the invoices and receipts and so on, and produce all accounts properly audited to the annual meeting of the congregation. Now, sometimes people ask, the next slide, please, Jim. People ask, what does properly audited mean? The word audit takes on a kind of precise and technical meaning in financial circles, but the church has said that there are 3 ways that a congregation of the Presbyterian Church in Canada can produce a properly audited report. First is by asking an external licensed public accountant to do a formal audit. This produces a high level of assurance that the accounts are properly kept, but will probably come with a fairly high price tag too. Second, a congregation may request a review from, again, an external licensed public accountant, but the review provides a more moderate level of assurance, doesn't go into the same details, it probably comes with a lower price tag. And third is the method probably most commonly used by Presbyterian congregations, and that is to have volunteers provide an independent and diligent scrutiny of the records to ensure that the receipts received and the disbursements made are properly documented. I should emphasize the word independent because relatives, close friends of the treasurer probably should not be auditing the books. Auditing the financial records, it's an important function because not only does it protect the treasurer from possible accusations of dishonesty, It can also protect the congregation from the occasional treasurer who might misappropriate funds that are placed in their care. Sadly, this does happen from time to time. Next slide. Yeah, there's more about audit details for anybody who wants to look into this question at a deeper level. Can do so by turning to the Acts and Proceedings 2008, which is available online. And those are the page numbers, the reference, or you can just write to me and I'd be happy to send you a copy, or if you want, you can phone the national office and I'll respond that way too.
And we're gonna really go in depth and look at some of the points that are raised in this 4th session, which is offered on January 13th.
Thanks, Karen. Could you back up one slide? I thought there was another one in there. No, okay, that's all right. I just want to mention that the treasurer, I don't know if this, maybe I've got something out of order here, but anyway, the treasurer involvement in the annual general meeting, besides preparing for the preparing financial report for the meeting, the treasurer may also be called by the board in session to help come up with the numbers when they are preparing a budget to be proposed to the congregation. At the annual general meeting, the treasurer may be asked to present the budget themselves or to answer questions about specific line items. The budget should be considered more, though, than just line items and numbers. As a minister myself, I think of the budget as being a reflection of, or at least it should reflect, who we believe God is calling us to be as congregations, or what is God calling us to do in our community, our own community, the community beyond the church doors, and around the world. So hopefully the session can help with that aspect of the budget preparation. So in terms of the Board of Managers work, sometimes as an alternative to electing a board, a session may choose to establish a committee of the session to look after the finance and maintenance concerns of the congregation. So being a committee of the session, such a committee would naturally include elders in order to have a good line of communication with the session, but it would also be open to other people in the congregation, other members and adherents, again, who have finance and maintenance skills and interests. While this would eliminate the need for a board, the role of the treasurer would remain unchanged, other than having a closer working relationship with the session or the session committee.
So Don, just some of the comments that are coming in with smaller congregations, they're saying that many of them don't have a board of managers. So they have this type of a finance committee and a session. So that was just sort of an affirmation of that.
Right, thank you. I'm currently the interim moderator for a 2-point charge, and one of them has a session and a small board, and the other has the session board working together. Basically, the whole session forms the work of a finance maintenance committee. And
there was just one other question before we go on. It was, can the independent volunteer for the audit still be someone in the church as long as they're not close to the treasurer, or does it need to be someone from the outside the church?
No, it definitely can be somebody in the church. Again, it's just a matter of appearances and so on. You could say, somebody close to the treasurer could provide a very accurate audit. It's just that, just how it looks, if it's your the son of the treasurer that's doing the auditing, it might just, people might raise questions. So it's just better to have somebody who's seen to be independent of the audit, of the treasurer doing the audit. Next slide, Jim. Yeah, so we also have, most congregations have elected trustees. Sometimes trustees go a long time without having responsibilities, but they are elected by congregation, and it's good to have trustees prepared to do the jobs that come up every now and then for trustees. A trust deed, every congregation should also have a trust deed, and that's a document that describes the role of trustees, how they're elected, how long they serve, what they're empowered to do, and so on. If your congregation has not prepared a trust deed, I recommend that you have a look in the Book of Forms. Near the back of the Book of Forms, there's a series of appendices, and one of them, Appendix C, provides a template for a trust deed that would help you to devise your own trust deed. It's important to know that trustees only have the authority and responsibilities assigned to them by the congregation. For example, if a church wanted to buy a piece of property, it would be a congregational decision, probably start with the session and the congregational decision, and then the congregation would empower the trustees to look after all the legal documents that needed signing. That would be instead of having all the members of the congregation line up at the realtor's office to sign whatever documents needed to be done. So the trustees are empowered in situations like that for specific tasks. We sometimes describe the relationship of the trustees and the congregation as saying the trustees are the pen in the hand of the congregation. Another way of saying the trustees do what the congregation asks them to do. The treasurer may well be involved in the financial transactions of the trustees, unless the trustees have been given authority by the congregation to look after that themselves. Some congregations are not able to find somebody within the congregation who has the time or ability to fulfill the tasks of a treasurer. In this case, one of the options would be to hire somebody outside the congregation to do the work. It might be the treasurer of a neighboring congregation, could be a professional accountant. But even if you hire a bookkeeper, it would be wise, perhaps necessary, to still have a treasurer in the congregation. And while the bookkeeper would do the financial aspects, the writing the checks and keeping records and so on, others can talk more detail about what that might look like. A treasurer in a congregation would be helpful as a communication link between the board of managers and the bookkeeper. The treasurer could advise the bookkeeper regarding payment priorities, which payments are urgent, which ones can wait a while, especially if finances are tight. Sometimes the treasurer could serve as a second signature on checks. I know in some situations, bookkeepers are only authorized to prepare checks up to a certain amount or for certain situations. And the treasurer would be called upon to sign checks as necessary, second signature on checks. Yes, and the treasurer would also be able to be a liaison back from the bookkeeper to the board, keeping them up to date on the financial situations of the congregation. A lot of churches also have an envelope secretary. And here you see before you on the screen a whole list of some of the things that an envelope secretary would do in terms of keeping track of offerings coming in. And in terms of the relationship with the treasurer, they would be expected to keep the treasurer informed regularly of the offering and other kinds of receipts that come into the congregation. All members and adherents have the right to vote at the annual congregational meeting. There are some certain legal decisions that only members can vote on, such as calling a minister or selling property, for example. But most of the decisions at the annual meeting don't fall into that category. So members and adherents can vote on the budget, they can propose amendments to the budget, and they adopt the budget. And it's the session who determines who are the professing members of the congregation and place those names on the professing members roll. And they also determine who are the adherents of the congregation and include those names in the church directory, the general church directory. Yeah, just my closing comment. I often find when I'm typing an email or a resource about treasurers, I misspell treasurer, and dropped the last R and ended up with the word treasure. And that's a typographical error, but I think there's some truth in that slip up, because I have found in many, many situations that a helpful treasurer is a sincere treasure to any congregation. So I thank God for all the treasurers out there and wish you well. I'm glad that you're able to share this time with us today.
Before you pass it off to Maurice, two other quick questions.
Yep.
Can the treasurer also be a trustee?
Yes, I think Yeah, the trustee, you have to be a member of the congregation. And I think that's the only restriction there. I don't think, it doesn't matter if you're a treasurer as well. It would be, again, it would be up to the congregation to make that decision by their voting, but it would be possible.
But the treasurer could be a trustee, okay?
That's
and
right.
Somebody else said, I thought the treasurer was not a member of the board or session.
Well, yeah, I was hoping nobody would ask that question. It's kind of, it varies from place to place, but the way it reads in the Book of Forms is that they are expected to be a member of the board. Again, within a congregation may choose to do something a little different that way. They might have a treasurer who attends board meetings but doesn't have a vote, and that would be the main difference. The treasurer, I would hope, would be able to attend many of the board meetings, whether they're a member or not. And if they were the treasurer, like any other member, would rotate off the board every 3 years, but any board member who's retires from the board can be immediately reelected, and so that often happens too.
Yeah, we have some really long-serving treasurers in
That's
our
right.
PPC. I know that.
I hope that answers the question. It's somewhat fuzzy, but I think strictly speaking, the treasurer would be a member of the board, but some congregations have a different way of managing that.
Okay, and we have some really small congregations. Somebody wanting to know, can a treasurer also serve as clerk of session at the same time?
Yeah. Again, you just need to be a member of the congregation to be elected as an elder, and then the session would choose you as the clerk of session. And treasurer doesn't have to be a member of the congregation, but if you were going to serve dual roles, yes, that would be possible.
That's all the questions for now. So Maurice, we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay, let's take some time to review the key duties and dates pertinent to the financial statements and management of the congregations. Gifts are given, they're freely given, and they're generally given without expectation. It may be either designated or undesignated. Within our congregation, when had our offering envelopes, we had 4 lines, and on those lines there were general fund, the Presbyterian sharing, missions, and other. And people then could designate how they wanted their gift to be used. Now the other covers quite a number of items, and I'll come back to those later on. But what you're trying to do is to transfer the property that you have and transfer it to the congregation. In most cases, it will be money, but again, there may be gifts in kind. Sometimes people give artwork or other property, or they may even give securities to the congregation. Whenever the gift is given, say it can be designated, which the congregation must accept, but it can also not be received because if they're putting too much restriction on it, and they can't change it after it has been given. So once you give, that's it, finished, unless you had specific targets or items that you wanted to give at that time. And something that we'll cover in a future seminar. Sometimes people, when they may give, say, $200, and it may be there's an advantage or a value benefit that they receive. In other words, they give $200, but they're attending a dinner, and so the amount of the dinner may be deducted from the tax receipt that you're going to receive. So we'll cover a lot of this in the next couple of sessions. Next slide. Again, as I said, the organizations create our designations, and they're called internal restrictions. May be moved or added by the organization itself. Again, as I said, we have on our envelopes, we've got general fund where we designate the money that's received to go to the general fund. We also then ask that the amounts for Presbyterian sharing be designated. And also we have our own missions group that we support outside of the Presbyterian sharing. So we have a number of items on there. Also in other, we have an amount or a line that is authorized by the session as to what may be included on that line. For example, a number of years ago, we had a tsunami in the Far East, and we agreed that we would designate any monies received on the other line to go to the Presbyterian World Service and Development to help out with the tsunami. We also have a food bank, and people sometimes bring food, but other people bring funds or donate funds, and that money is kept in an account. And then if we need a particular food item, then we will take the money from the account to buy the food to support our food bank. Donors, sorry, just back one. Donors can create external restrictions. The organization must accept them or reject them, or may accept them or reject them. We've got to watch what restrictions are being placed on them. A number of years ago in our congregation, someone wanted to make or had left a bequest for a substantial amount of money. And when the request came to the session turned it down. The reason was that the donor wanted to change the name of the church to their name. And so we restricted or said, no, we will not get it. And we give up on a substantial amount of money in that case. So there may be restrictions that are placed on it by the donor. But again, I'll talk about it later, that you've got to watch out when you're receiving donations if there are restrictions placed upon them. Next slide. We talk about funds and accounts, and we need to just, I guess it gets into a definition of what is in which account. We may call them accounts. So we've got a money, and it may be money for going into a bank account. Now, that may be funds for specific items. It may just go into the general fund, or it may be designated by the individual, for example, into a vacation Bible school or a music account, or as I mentioned, the food bank. Also, we could also have items called funds, and that may also determine where the funds are placed into a specific bank, or so that we can keep track of them within our financial accounting system. Or we may have a project that we're going to work on going forward on the funds. Again, if I can just give an example, quite a number of years ago within our local congregation, we had different treasurers and different funds, looking after different funds. And at one stage we said, this is ridiculous because we're paying all these bank charges for various funds. So we put all the funds into one bank account and then control it through the one bank account as it goes forward. But we keep track of what's in the bank account and which funds that those monies belong to. Next slide. Again, we talked about the bank accounts. I said we do keep track of where we've got the money, how much money is in there as we go through and do our financial statements on a month-to-month basis. And again, I've said that we've got one bank account that holds multiple funds or accounts that it's keeping track of, and we keep track of those. We also have one account that is not included in the church's main account. It's the benevolent fund, and we have certain restrictions on it as to who can sign the checks and who can authorize expenditures on that. So we do keep track of the money. The money may come into the general fund or come in as part of the envelopes that we receive, and it may be designated to the benevolent fund, and then it goes into the bank and eventually gets transferred to the special bank account that we have. So keeping track of precise details is important as you go forward. Next slide. Want to talk about budgets. And on the budgets are something that are drawn up and help us to control the budget that the congregation is going through. We may do it for a year, and within the year, we could also end up keeping track of it as we go forward on a month-to-month basis. It helps us to manage our financial position and the goals for income and expenses. One of the things that we do is when we're going through, or after we've set the budget, have the budget approved, we will go back and have a look at roughly, when we try to break it out into monthly budgets and into cash flow, which we'll talk about later, we go through and look at past history to see where and how much we can expect within a particular month for a budget. We receive the income, and income may just be offerings coming in through your envelope. It may come in through other means, and again, we'll talk about that later on. And the other part of the budget will be how you're going to spend that money, how it's going to be spent out in relation to the missions of the congregation. Next slide. We talked about the cash flow. And one of the things that you always want to make sure is that you have sufficient funds in the bank. As I was saying, we try to do, once we get the budget approved for the year, we go through and look at it and try to allocate how much money we think we would be coming in, say through offerings. So we'll go back and look at a 3-year average. And it gets kind of difficult, or it has been difficult over the last year or so because of the COVID and lack of open or in-person services. But again, we look through the income, how much we received on a month-by-month basis over a 3-year period, then try to average it out and say, this is how much we should receive going forward. Again, it also reflects, in some cases, depending on the month that you're looking at. In 1 year, they may have, a month may have 5 weeks, another year may only have 4 weeks. It's just a general idea, is to keep track of the funds and when they will be coming in. We also want to make sure that we've got money to cover our expenses. Again, in most cases, for example, your stipends and salaries are probably going to be equal throughout the year. However, when you get into other types of expenses, for example, we only pay insurance once a year, so that we would put that into the particular month in which it's going in. When you'll talk about or think about the utilities within the congregation, you may find that in the summer months, your hydro, your gas may be lower. And then in the months towards December, January, February, you're going to have a higher amount that we allocate. But the important thing is to make sure that you do the cash flow by month, so that when you come through the year, you're not ending in a position that you're going to have no money in the bank to pay the bills that are coming in, or you may be sitting on them, you may have deferred them. But again, you just got to keep watching on your cash flow as you go forward. Next slide. We also have investments, and again, these may be stocks, bonds. Probably most commonly, congregations will, if they've got some money, they will put it into GICs, mutual funds, and we're also, I'm not sure of how many people are aware of what's known as the Consolidated Portfolio, which is a fund that I believe there's about 125 congregations, presbyteries, synods, and a few head office accounts that have invested in this fund. I think it's the market value at the end of September was over 200 million. And the number of people, congregations have contributed to that. One of the things, the reason why we get into it as a congregation, when we sold our manse, we put the money into the Consolidated Portfolio, and then on a quarterly basis, we draw out income from the portfolio and use it to pay the Minister's Housing Allowance. So we do have some idea. We just didn't have people that would spend time going through month after month or every quarter looking at the investments that we wanted to make and make the decisions whether to buy, sell, or what we will want to do. Again, it's all subject to market fluctuation. In the case of the consolidated portfolio, it has been increasing in the quarter ended March, quarter ended June, but there was a slight slip in the end of September, but I expect that it will have picked up again as the market has picked up. The investments that we want to, or the congregation may want to put in, you've got to consider your risk, your tolerance, and your time zone. In other words, do you want to just put it in for a year, or do you want to make your investment for a long-term entity or time, in which case, in our case, for the Man's Fund, we've put it in for the long period of time. You can also do some work in putting the guidelines together to manage the risk, to consider risk. Sometimes people or congregations don't want to invest in particular types of companies or industries because they don't believe that those are the right places that they should be investing in. And so you need some guidelines on your investment policy as you go forward. Next one. Endowment funds. Again, we have a number of endowment funds, or well, with one anyway, where the person had put in the money. They had specified that it was to be used for mission, Presbyterian-related mission work, not the Presbyterian sharing or PWS&D, but it had a particular guideline and approach that needed to be listed on it. The principle cannot be used without permission. Once you put it in, it's got to stay there unless there has been a right that has been listed down in the bequest language as to what it may be used for. The earnings or the income are available. They may be distributed, as we've been doing over the years, or we have just reinvested it in the hope that someday we find a suitable project that we can invest it in, subject to the original terms of the donation that was made or the endowment that was made. One of the things that we were looking at recently in our own congregation was, what can we use this money for? And we were sitting there and it was growing. Originally it was about $12,000, but now it had reached up to $35,000. We hadn't been spending, obviously, the money, but we had to go through and dig through the records to see what it was that could be used for. And so it's important that you keep track of the documentation as to what the uses can be made for the endowment that has been received, and how you can spend the income, or whether it must all be accumulated. But in most cases, you can spend at least the income, but not the principal. Next slide. We go down to a balance sheet within the congregation. You'll obviously have your cash, and hopefully not bank overdrafts. You'll have your investments. You'll have your property, your land, your building, your internal fixtures, like of organs and pews and what other things that you have put into the building. You may have receivables depending on the way in which you do your accounting, whether it's on a cash basis or an accrual basis. But in some cases, if you are working on an accrual basis, you may make a receivable for a grant that you've applied for but not yet received. Similarly, you may have applied for your HST rebates and you haven't received it before the end of the year, so you would have it in receivables. You also may have some prepaids. Again, we had an amount that we had set aside or had paid over to a camp, but because of COVID, the camp didn't take place, but we left the money with the camp so that whenever we get back to normal, we can again use that deposit that was made to fund the camp program whenever we get going again. Next slide. Liabilities. Within the liabilities, you will also have your, if you're on an accrual basis, you probably will have your bills that are unpaid, or you may even have loans. Now, a number of congregations that I've reviewed, they may have mortgages on their property. Maybe it was a new property that was built, and one of the things that they try to do and disclose it on the financial statements is that they will list down as a current liability the amount of money that they expect they're going to have to pay out towards the repayment of the mortgage in the current year. And then the balance of the mortgage outstanding will be shown as a separate line between the current liabilities and the accumulated capital that's shown on there. So you've got to consider how you disclose this and how much you're disclosing and the way you're disclosing it current versus long-term mortgages. Next slide. When we come to the operating statement, we talk about a surplus. Sometimes people refer this as profit and loss, but since we're a not-for-profit organization, we will then call it an operating statement. If you end up with more revenue than income, you're going to have a surplus, and that surplus will be then reinvested back into the congregation. It's possible that it ends up the other way and you end up with a deficit. In other words, you will have more expenses than you received in the year by way of income. And so you've got a choice, so you've got to decide how you're going to fund that. And it may be, and hopefully you have some surpluses from prior years that you can use to offset the deficit in the year that has just occurred, where the deficit has occurred. The financial statements are a summary of the financial reports for a specific time period. It may be the producer or the treasurer produces financial statements on a monthly basis. They may produce them on a quarterly basis, but there is a reporting that is required to be prepared so that the leadership within the congregation can see how we're doing, how they're doing in relation to income, how it's coming in, what is being expensed, and where we're going as we go forward through the rest of the year, or when we get to the end of the year, how did we do? Did we end up with a surplus, or did we end up in a deficit position? So this just gives an accounting of where we are throughout the year. Next slide. We're going to talk about audits and reviews. Don has already mentioned about audits and reviews, but we will be looking at those in more detail in the fourth session in January. Again, the audit is someone other than the treasurer. It prevents fraud. I also have worked with some congregations where they've had fraud, and I've come in to try to help them go forward in resolving those matters. It's a constitutional matter. We've got to make sure that we're paying attention to what's going on within the accounting of our records. And we also have talked and will talk again about using internal auditors, people from within the church, and those who are maybe chartered accountants or professional accountants, and they will do either audits or reviews or notices to reader. So there are various types of reviews that can be done, but we'll cover these in detail in January 13th seminar. Next report, next slide. Assessments and allocations. Again, congregations are encouraged to accept an allocation. You probably have already received your proposed allocation that has come out from Winford Drive earlier on this month, and saying this is what we're proposing. And you as a congregation have then got to decide what you're going to accept. The recommendation or the recommended allocation is 10% of the dollar base. The dollar base is something that is determined on the statistical report that is filed each year. And so they take 10% of that. Congregations then have the opportunity to say, yes, we're going to accept the allocation as determined by the PCC, or they can say, no, we want to accept something less. Or you may want to say, no, we can afford it, we can go a bit higher. But again, there's an opportunity to increase your accepted allocation as you go through. Some congregations have it just as a one-line item on their budget. And in our case, we have it as a separate line and a separate line on our envelopes. So we know how much we have committed to, and then how we can work forward to satisfying that commitment. Again, if we accepted an amount and then offerings do come in, we will, and if the offerings come in over the accepted amount, we will continue to send those full amounts into the PCC. We just try to keep up and make sure that we have that funds remitted on a quarterly basis. And we talk about remittances later on. Sometimes, again, congregations will have presbytery and synod assessments. Again, these are generally based on either numbers of individuals within the congregations. The presbyteries and the synods, they determine how much must be paid and how much is going to be paid within the year. Again, these amounts will vary depending on the presbytery and the synod, and the basis that they use will also vary going forward. The congregational pension assessment, again, congregations are expected to remit a portion of the pension to the pension fund. It's 5% of what is known as the dollar base, and I talked about it earlier on. And so the congregation, in addition to deducting the amount from the pension, would also, pension from the minister would also have to make a contribution. But I just realized this is probably something that Karen and Nicole should be talking about. Sorry about that.
I think you've covered it fairly well, Maurice. Nicole, was there anything you wanted to add?
Agreed. Maurice, you covered it very well. I just wanted to, I could maybe just to help out the employers that they understand that the pension plan congregational assessment supports the defined benefit pension plan for ministers and professional church workers. It is a legal requirement that the assessment is paid on a monthly basis, and so that must be remitted. We do send out the notices in November for budgeting purposes for the upcoming year, and then we send out another reminder in January of what the assessment amounts are. But I think Maurice has done a really good job highlighting it at a high level.
I'll just do a little check-in. We're at 3 o'clock. We still have quite a number of slides to go through. We had originally thought we'd have about 15 minutes for question and answer, but we've been doing them as we go along. But we will get to question and answers at the end, and we'll keep going. We can keep going if we go past 3:15 with the questions and answers, and people will get copies of the recording if they have to leave early. So back to you, Maurice.
Okay, we're going to look at the duties and the dates as to when stuff must be completed by. Part of the Book of Forms, and I'm going to try to read this regarding the Book of Forms when you receive gifts, but again, we may talk about this a bit later. The Book of Forms, section 170, states that where there is a chartered bank convenient to the congregation, it is a duty of the treasurer to deposit therein without delay all monies received by him/her into a separate account, identifying it as belonging to the congregation. So the monies need to be deposit. It used to be, I know in our congregation that when we used to have 2 services, during the second services, we'd be counting the offering from the first service. And then after the offering was collected for the second service would be taken in and they would count it. And then immediately after that, the funds would be taken to the bank, which was across the street from us. However, because of the COVID and what has been going on there, we're not receiving as many in-person gifts. And so we've been accumulating them. And then eventually twice a month or 3 times a month, the office secretary and another individual will go in, open the offering envelopes, determine the bank deposit and take it over to the bank. Also, we've seen a lot of, over the last recent years, a lot of people are now using e-transfers or making online gifts. Some of them are using the PAR, which is a service, if you wanted, that we use in conjunction with the United Church to make our donations, and the money is transferred to the individual congregations on the 20th of the month. We also may be getting money through Canada Helps or some of the other, items or places where you can make donations. But again, we'll talk more about this next week. We're also required to issue annual receipts for the gifts that we receive. Some of them will be annual, some of them may just be a one-off receipt. And again, depending on the type of offering that we have received or the gift that we received, it will also depend on, specify the type of and the wording on the receipt that is issued. Next slide. Again, we're going to talk more about this later in another seminar, but within the operating budget, you'd also obviously have your payroll, your utilities, any worship-related expenses, any maintenance that maybe is going on within the church, not necessarily capital, but some of just the regular maintenance that is used. We also have program expenses and mission and outreach. Those are the main types of budget items that you would expect to see in an operating budget and how they will be dispersed. In some cases, you will have special funds like of a capital fund or a benevolent fund, or the endowment or legacy funds, which can also be dispersed. But I say, again, we'll talk about these 2 weeks from today. Next slide. Producing the financial statements, again, something that we'll talk about in January, but there's a number of statements that need to be processed. In most cases, it's going to be the same statement, but it will have various users that need to know. First of all, you're going to have the session, who are the leadership within the congregation. We have the members and the donors. And again, we'll produce financial statements for them and present them at the congregational meeting. Within the Synod, the Presbytery, and National Office, particularly when reporting on the statistical report, the financial statements need to be accompany the statistical report that is held at Winford Drive. We also need to produce the statements, and when the statements are done, we also need to then send them to the CRA along with the T3010, which is the charitable information return that needs to be filed annually. Assuming that if you've got a December year end, the filing date for that would be June 30th going forward. Again, within certain cases, there may be if you've got, say, a mortgage or a loan, the person that has loaned you the money, the entity that has loaned you the money, maybe the banks, will also need to see the copies of the financial statements. Similarly with the insurance company, they may need certain information to be available to them. But again, we'll cover these at a future seminar or webinar. Next slide. This is a long list here, but this is extracted from the Treasurer's workbook, our handbook, and it kind of lists down and summarizes the items that need to be done by the Treasurer. You need to keep up with your signing authorities who can sign the for banks, and again, maybe for the checks, maybe you have 2 signers, maybe you have 1 signer going forward. You also need to see who's going to be authorized to sign those payments or sign the checks or to release the funds. We need contact information for the CRA and for the National Church. We've got government filings that have to be done. Again, it could be payroll related items that need to be released or sent forward. We also need a system that can be used for handling the cash, the budgeting, and receipting financial statements. And again, I think in the last slide, Jim's going to talk about that towards the last slide, I think it is. He's going to be talking about what type of software you can use. We need to update and make sure that we're making our remittances to the national office on a timely basis. And we just talked about that there. Need to do bank reconciliations. Important that these are done on a monthly basis so that we know that the bank is properly reconciled. I've come on some situations where the bank was not properly reconciled and there were certain items that had been listed as outstanding for a long period of time, which we ended up reversing to close it out. Also, within the last month, I had issued a check from the Presbytery, and the amount that appeared on the check didn't agree with the amount that appeared on the bank statement. So I had to contact the bank to get the correction made to that. Also need to make sure that you've got computer backup systems. If you're keeping record of your financial statements on the computer, you need to have backup for that. You need to know record retention, and then what you want to do with your investments, your restricted funds, your long-term commitments as you go forward. So it's something that if you look at the Treasurer's Handbook, you'll be able to see a lot of these items listed down in there. Next slide. I want to talk about the duties. Again, these are kind of broken down weekly, monthly, semi-annual, annually. Again, we've already talked about making sure that we get the receipts into the bank, get them recorded in our financial statements, depending on what you're using. Make sure you can pay the approved invoices. In some cases, you may get them prepared and pay them weekly. Sometimes you may do them all at once at the end of the month. We need to make sure that you're doing your payroll and your stipends on a monthly basis, making sure that the deductions and the pension and income tax, etc., are all remitted on a timely basis. Again, if I can mention, depending on your congregation, you may be required either to remit your deductions to the CRA on a monthly or on a quarterly basis. Depending on the record that you have got with the CRA, they may allow you to do it on a quarterly basis rather than having to do it every month. But again, that's up to the CRA, and they will tell you on an annual basis whether you can do it quarterly or monthly. Making sure that the bank account is reconciled, making sure that you've remitted all your assessments, the pension assessments and Presbyterian sharing. Semi-annually, you can apply for the HST and the GST rebates. And then annually, you need to prepare the financial statements and assist with the budgeting, budget preparing the T4s and T4As. That will be generally done in January, February, and then preparing and submitting to CRA your T3010 in June if you've got a December year end.
Maurice, I've got some people asking, is this a paid position?
What a paid position?
The treasurer.
No.
Yeah, generally not, right? It's a lot.
Generally not. It's generally a volunteer time that is allowed. A person will volunteer and will be asked and will volunteer to do the work Now, one of the things that maybe I should mention is that even though it's a volunteer position, you also may need or consider drawing up a schedule of your duties and all the jobs that you do, because if anything ever happened to you, you've got to have someone there to be able to back you up. Or if you decide, I'm not going to do it again, you need to be able to have it documented so that people can pick up the job after you have gone, whether you've left or whether you've died. So it's just something that needs to be followed up and document your job description.
So that said, churches will also often have bookkeepers or admin staff who may support the treasurer in gathering this information and in doing this role.
That's correct.
And is it possible, maybe Dawn, you can answer this, is it possible, can the congregation provide an honorarium for a treasurer?
It's always possible.
Possible.
I just saw a comment come up in the chat that one of the treasurers receives an honorarium. Yeah, it's possible. It's not common, but it's possible. We could take a vote and see what the treasurers say today.
After this list, I think they should be paid well.
Yes, they should.
But you know, everyone's storing up their treasures in heaven too. So we know where the treasurers are going to sit, right beside Jesus.
Okay.
Go on.
Okay, getting into the annual cycle. I think some of this I already have spoken to. You've got to prepare your annual reports and prepare for the meetings. Approve the budgets for the congregational meeting that will then approve financial statements of the prior year and the budget for the current year. You've at least once a year prepared a claim to get your HST and your GST back. February 28th is certain deadlines. You've got to issue receipts. Although I think the last time I checked, February 20th is not a requirement that you issue receipts by that date, but it is a common practice that receipts are issued by that date so that people can use them to prepare their return. But I don't know that it's a hard deadline within the CRA, but we may find out before the next session as to exactly what date we need to have on there. We've got to distribute your T4s to your employees. You file the summary of the payroll information with CRA by the February 28th. And in some cases, I know within our presbytery, congregations are asked to report to the presbytery the amount of stipend that they're going to be paying the minister. We just do this to make sure that the stipends being paid at least equal the minimum amount that's laid down by the presbytery when a minister is called. In March and April, in fact, I had one congregation that sent me a message yesterday saying that they have accepted their allocation for 2022 already. And so I'm just waiting to be able to file that on the website so that we can go forward with that one. I generally, within our presbytery, collect the information and then just put it all onto the website for them. June 30th is the deadline for filing the T3010s. And then when you get to November and December, you get into budgeting and planning for the next year's cycle. That's assuming that everyone has a December 31st year end. I know we've had I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we decided quite a number of years ago that we would change our year end to June so that it would match the church year, as we call it, because most programs run from September through to May, June. And so we changed our year end, but it also has difficulties with it as well. It has some implications that we've got to work through. I'm not advocating that everyone changes their year end, but I'm just saying that there are items that we can discuss further if we need to. Next slide. Again, important dates. We've kind of touched on these. Presbyterian sharing, you need to remit it monthly if you're receiving them as a designated offering, or at least quarterly. Again, we talked about congregations meeting their deadlines and having their sufficient cash. And it's the same thing for the PCC. They need to make sure that they've got the sufficient money coming in. If you look at the reports that come out on generally a monthly basis, you'll see in the month of December on most years, you'll find that there's a substantial amount of the remittances are left to December before they're remitted. But the PCC needs to be paying its bills as well, and it needs to have its income coming in. Again, we need to do the monthly remittances for the pension deductions and insurance from the minister's stipend. We need to be paying the monthly assessments. Health and dental comes out on a quarterly basis. And so you need to, whenever you receive that invoice, to promptly pay it as well. Within our presbytery, we have assessments that are due on a quarterly basis, the 1st of February, May, August, and November. And I've also said to some congregations, if you want, I'll take post-dated checks and hold them until the due date. So again, this is going to depend on each presbytery as to what their timeline is for receiving the assessments from congregations. Next slide. The art of delegation. The worst committee to be on is the one that you don't like. And so you need to collaborate, you need to delegate, encourage, communicate, and monitor what it is that's going on with the committee. Don't just sign up for any committee, say, yeah, I'll do it if you don't like what you're going to be asked to do. You need to break down, the treasurer needs to break down the work. If he's going to share some of that work or if he's going to dole it out to others, you need to break it down so that it matches the skills of the people that are involved and are coming forward to volunteer. So you ask, you let them do it, and you thank them for doing it. And who needs to be at all these meetings? Sometimes we have meeting after meeting, and sometimes my wife tells me I'm getting zoomed out with all the meetings I'm going to. But sometimes we don't need to be at all the meetings. You need to be selective and ensure that what you're going to is important, and you need to be there if it is so important. Next slide. Budgets. I've just lost my notes.
We're just looking at our time. We've got about, I think, whether 4 or 5 slides that look at budgets at high level. And then we still will move to question and answers. This first webinar, just so people know, it's the bigger one. The others get really into depth on all of these issues, but because they're more focused, it's a little easier to sort of stay on top of the time. So thank you for your patience.
Okay. You need when you're preparing budgets, when you're going to present them to the congregation, they've got to be able to understand them. It's just not a matter of putting down a lot of numbers and presenting it. Sometimes people will not understand when they get to a congregational meeting what it is that you're trying to convey to them, or where certain things may be included. For example, salaries and stipends, what's in there, who's getting paid for what. In some cases, I know in our congregation, whenever we're approving a budget, that we actually ask the people that are within the congregation who are staff that they leave so we can have a free discussion on what's going on within the budgets. We've got to be providing timely information. It's got to be relevant. It's got to be reliable as to what it is that you're putting out. And it's got to be consistent year to year to year. You can't just put in maybe 10 months of expenses in one year and maybe 14 months in next because you forgot to pick up some items. But they've got to be on a consistent basis as you go forward in preparing those budgets. Next slide. When we set budgets, what we do is that we will communicate, the treasurer will communicate with all what we call the stakeholders, the people that are maybe running programs and things like that, ask them what amount of money do they want included in their budget for the next year. So we go through and gather that information. It will then come to the Finance Committee when he has prepared the budget. We will look at the amounts and are listed down. And I think I'm going to be talking later on about how much are the best approach to getting into it. But we gathered the information from the stakeholders, and we could also use it. We may, if we're doing it in November or December, we would then take the latest information, the actuals for the year to date, and we would do a guesstimate or a projection for the balancing 2-3 months that we need to see what type of results we are projecting that we're going to end up with. And that will become a basis for our budgets for the following year. Next slide. Okay, when you get into budgeting, you've got to choose between two bases of budgets. One is a traditional budgeting, using the prior year's expenses as your base, and then build in a factor for inflation and other known charges. Or you can go back to zero-based budgeting and start from the beginning, having nothing on and going forward from there. Now, one of the things I did mention that our congregation has a June year end. When we were doing our budgets last May, we had just gone into the COVID, and we found it difficult to project or to do a budget for the full year 2021 through to June 21. So we looked at what was available. We didn't have much sense because from March to June, things were starting to close down. So what we did in that case was we just took a budget and put it for 3 months. So we went to the congregation in June, present them with a 3-month budget, and that did for the month of July, August, and September. In September, we went back again, looked at the results, what was being generated, and how we were going forward. And again, we still didn't have confidence what was going to happen in relation to reopening the churches, people coming back for online worship, in-house worship, or whether they're going to continue online again. And then how much money we were going to receive coming in, whether it was through e-transfers or people dropping off their envelopes through the church door or coming to the services. So we did a second 3-month budget. And then when we got to December, we said, okay, well, I think we've now got sufficient that we can use that information to go forward. So we did a 6-month budget for January to December and added it all together to go forward. But it was just one of those things that we just couldn't express our numbers, or we're confident with the numbers that we could put on into our budgets, given the circumstances that we're finding ourselves in with the COVID. The other item then is going into zero-based budgeting, where you start from zero and then just work up from each of them. The traditional budgeting is a simplified system and is done regularly with a similar approach. Where you use zero-based budgeting is quite complex, since it encourages revaluation every time that you go through it. Traditional budgeting is based on historic information, and so revolves around previous year's accounting. Zero-based budgeting revolves around based on estimates, and so it involves decision-making as we go forward. Say the simplest one is using the traditional budgeting rather than zero-based budgeting. The other question that comes up is, you start with the revenue and see what you can afford by way of expenses, or do you start with expenses and see how much money you have to raise? And again, you've got to try to balance or juggle these two items as you go forward. It may be that you know what all your expenses are and you fill them in, and then you said, okay, well, we need to raise X number of dollars. And when you put it in, you say, no, that's not going to work for us because we're asking for too much money there. And so you maybe have to go back and trim your expenses. So that's one way of doing it. You could, again, if you'd started with the revenue, you could say, this is the amount of money we think we'll get. We're through the expenses. Oh, we've got a deficit again, so we need to go back and start to cut expenses or try to see if there's anything that we can raise additional funds on. Next slide. The annual budgets. Again, it depends on what way you want to go forward. I did mention earlier on, and you generally don't want to end up with a deficit budget. You want to have a budget that is balanced. It may be that when you do it, you've got to think about what can I delete off. I know when we were doing our budgets in the last year, we were very fortunate that when we went through it and we picked up all the grants that were available to us, both from the Presbytery and from the federal government, we ended up with a substantial amount of a surplus on our budget. Now, we had originally started off with a balanced budget. We ended up with surplus. When we did the following year's budget, the 22 budget, we're ending up with a deficit, but we're going to apply the surplus that we earned last year to the deficit to cover the deficit that we have incurred or will incur during the current year. But we'll also be looking at if there are expenses that we can cut off or trim down going forward within the congregation. Again, when you're getting into line items, you need to make sure that you've explained them properly to your congregation, whether it's line items. You may find that you group a number of accounts together, or you may just list them all down and people can see exactly what it is that you're going to go forward with. Next slide. One of the things that you need to remember, it's not just the operating statements, but you also need to know if there are future expenditures like major renovations, improvements to the roof, the furnace, or in some cases, I know that some congregations have experienced flooding problems in their basement. So you need to try to plan for these unusual expenses. They're not the regular operating, but they're generally a one-time only type of expense. Again, I think I mentioned that we have a development fund where someone had given us some money, and we used those funds. We put it into a development fund, and then we went through and updated and did renovations to the washrooms in the facilities. Unfortunately, this happened just before the COVID, so we haven't been using the washrooms as much as we would like to have used them because of the situation that we now find ourselves in. Next slide. Budgeting process. Who draws it up? Generally, it's the Finance Committee and the Treasurer. Now, I sit on the Finance Committee of our congregation, and we also report, the Finance Committee reports to Stewardship, and Stewardship reports to the session. So anything that the Finance Committee does, it rolls forward up through Stewardship and then onto the session. But we do seek input from the board, from the session, from the committees and the stakeholders, as I've previously said. Again, the timeline, if you're looking for doing budgets, assuming you've got a December year end, you should probably be starting to prepare those now. I know, again, in some congregations, they have meetings in December so that they can approve their budget for the following year. That means that come January 1st, they can pay the minister the stipend that they've got in the budget rather than having to wait until a congregational meeting, maybe in February or March, and then they've got to go back and give him the adjustment for his stipend for the first 2 months that they had missed off. Again, with the budgeting process, you want to either do it and have a congregation meeting in December, as some congregations I know are doing, or do it in early January, February. Again, I've seen some congregations leaving it as late as March before approving the budgets, and that's too late to be doing that. You should have them done starting in November, going forward, either processing them in December, approving them in December, or doing it in early January and February at the very latest going forward. Next slide. I think this is Jim.
Yeah, so the accounting and donation software can really help you build your budgets and produce financial statements. And in the newly updated Treasurer's Handbook, you'll find a table comparing the available software options. In 2021, just this past year, congregations were surveyed to find out what software products they were using for accounting and to keep track of donations. More than 400 churches responded. And so the newly updated Treasurer's Handbook now includes charts that list the types of accounting and donation software products that the surveyed PCC congregations indicated they are using. And it also explains how they feel about them. They're on out of 5 stars. So the PCC doesn't endorse any software, as congregations' needs are varied and diverse depending on their circumstances. So in choosing an option, you might consider cost, the size of the budget, reporting capabilities, customization of the program, the number of donors you have, and the compatibility with the donation tools you're using. So congregations are free to select their own software to best suit their needs. And I'm hoping that this research will help you guide you in possibly looking through what's available. Oops. Okay. There we go.
Okay. Jim, you can look this up. Somebody asked what page that is on in the Treasurer's Handbook. So you can look it up while I...
Sure, it's section 5.1.
Oh, section 5.1, right, great,
Yeah.
Okay. Just a reminder that the recording will be available at presbyterian.ca leadership webinars. And so that's if you, we're also gonna email you the link once it's available, but then we'll get it posted up there. So when you lose the link, you can navigate around the church website and find it. And then just to remind you about the upcoming webinars, there were lots of questions in the chat and we've been touching on some of them. And I know some of them we said, we're gonna get to that in depth in the upcoming ones. Jim, next slide. But just so you know, the one next week on December 2nd really looks into receiving and receiving God's gift. And both Maurice and I attended the most recent webinar that was presented by the CRA. And so we really have some great details and good examples that we have been inspired by their webinar to pass that information. And somebody did answer in the chat that February 28th, it's not a technical deadline by the CRA that you have to have the receipts out that way. That said, I think that it's a very good deadline for you at least to try and meet. And if possible, do it earlier. Otherwise, you may have a number of your church members going, where's my receipt? And there's nothing you want to do. You don't want to annoy your donors. You want them to be like, oh, look, my receipt. Yes, I guess I have to start getting ready to file my taxes. On December 9th, we'll look at all your expenditure questions. So when it's like writing checks and all of that, we'll look really in depth into the expenditures and the how to pay different things and what you need to do, and look at those deadlines again. And then on the 13th, we look at telling the story, and we're going to look at telling the story to everyone. That includes the government by filling out your T3010s, the accession, how to do the statistical report, and how to tell it narratively, how to tell donors that will inspire them to give to the congregation. So we hope that you'll join us for those upcoming webinars as well. And so now, we're sorry that we took you so long, but what more do you want to know? What questions do you have? People are free to go, but if you've got some that you'd like to ask, and I'm going to start off by asking Oliver. Did Oliver manage to join us? And Grace, can you unmute Yes. Oliver? There we go. Oliver, somebody asked about the consolidated portfolio. So can you just tell us a little bit about the consolidated portfolio and who manages it, and just some broad strokes?
The consolidated portfolio, we have 4 investment managers that invest in a diversified portfolio, including Canadian equity, US equity, and international equities. The Investment Advisory Committee make decision on the consolidated portfolio. Right now, the balance on the fund is around $250 million. Half belongs to the church, and about half belongs to 123 unit holders, and that composed of congregations, presbytery, and colleges.
Are the camps allowed to invest in the consolidated portfolio?
Yes, camp are allowed it. The minimum investment is $150,000. And if you want more information, I can send you all the details.
Okay, great. Somebody else had, and I'm not sure who's the best to answer this, whether it's Maurice or Oliver, or maybe Nicole. Somebody said that their minister is retiring at the end of the year and the church wants to make them a substantial gift. Or what are the tax implications if they make a substantial gift to a retiring minister?
I think if you receive a benefit from your employment, so this is included as a benefit to your employment. So if you receive anything from your congregation, it has to be a taxable benefit.
I agree.
That's my understanding as well, but I wanted to hear it from the experts. So. All right, great. I think that we have covered all the questions. I'm just looking back at, oh, we're gonna talk about, okay, there was a question, let me just, from Ian about whether or not congregations are required to follow the general accepted accounting practices.
Yes.
All right. And Jim, I know you can answer this one. How do you send an e-transfer if your bank requires 2 signatures? Can you just talk briefly about congregations setting up e-transfers?
Yeah, the reason, what happens is most congregations will consider this, and it may not necessarily be the best thing, but you can talk through it in session and the board. The reason why a lot of congregations can't accept e-transfers is because they don't have online banking. And the reason why they don't have online banking is they don't have an active debit card that can do transactions. So once you've activated a debit card, a working debit card for somebody, or locked up in the safe, whatever, but as long as you've got a working debit card, then you have working online banking. And with working online banking, you can accept e-transfers. So that's really what it comes down to. Now, in a bank account that has 2 signatories, how can you have 1 debit card? So that has to be negotiated with your individual bank. Most of the chartered banks will do this. Sometimes the managers will be a little reluctant to do it, in my experience with the congregations I've spoken to. And sometimes they have to sort of search around to find another manager to explain to that manager how it's done. But it can be done. And it's just important, if I may, one last bullet point, and that is if you do manage to get it done, be certain to set up automatic deposit. It's very important for the security of e-transfers that they go directly into your account.
And you want to be able to show that you've got a way of collecting the information as to who sent the e-transfer, what their address is, so that you can properly issue the receipt.
Absolutely.
The one advantage about e-transfers is that there's a paper trail with them. So there's always that important paper trail that we want.
But they are insecure without auto deposit.
Okay. Yeah. So someone said their bank wouldn't allow auto deposit. Yeah, sometimes you just have to talk to banks, and it's different banks. So if you've looked into it, it isn't. It's really
it's branch by branch. It really is.
And all we can say is that lots of churches have managed to figure it out some way, and it really has helped them a lot during COVID. And it's a very economical way. It's certainly much more economical than donating by credit card. And the PAR is great, but PAR is pre-authorized remittance, but that's for your regular donors, whereas an e-transfer might be somebody who's just come once and they just want to send a money or different amounts every month. So
yeah, if your bank isn't allowing auto deposit, you might want to ask them, is our bank account type allowed to have a working debit card? If they say yes, then it's likely that e-transfers would all of a sudden be possible. But you have to remember, now you have a working debit card. And is that something your church really wants? So it's not a simple question.
Yeah. All right, we're gonna look, I told Ian that we would look at balance sheets and how to do stuff like market values on balance sheets in future webinars. So I've noted that down, and we'll look at that, as well as amortization. Somebody also asked about church housing and clergy housing, and we are definitely going to cover that in session number 3 when we look at expenditures. So I think I'm going to wrap this up because we've all been here for much longer than we thought. Continue to email us your questions if you've got questions. We want to be as helpful as possible. Just thank you once again for attending, and we'll get the recordings out to you as soon as possible. We'll see if we can clean them up a little to cut anything out so that the time is minimized. Thank you again. Bye.